All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome to Exposing Powerful Lies. How's it going? Oh my goodness, look at my hair. Oh my goodness. Oh man, it's been a while, y'all. It's been a while since we've done a show. Been working the job, working hard. I'm super happy today. Really excited for this one. Thank you all for sticking around, for hanging out, and for being here. Please remember to like and share. Today we're joined by Father John Whiteford, who's a guest I've wanted to speak to for quite a long time. I spoke with my priest today about it after liturgy, and he was really excited. So I asked him a few things that he would want us to cover as well. So I'm going to read his bio from Patristic Faith because it's a lot, better written than anything I could come up with. Father John Whiteford is archpriest and pastor at Saint Jonah Orthodox Church in Spring, Texas. He was born in Riverside, California in 1966 and lived in Grand Terrace, California. Father John and his family moved to Murray, Kentucky in 1976 and then to Houston, Texas in 1978. He was raised in the Church of the Nazarene but began studying Orthodoxy while working on his BA in theology at Southern Nazarene University in Bethany, Oklahoma. Father John decided to convert not long after graduating from there in 1990. He was baptized at St. Benedict Orthodox Church in Oklahoma City on November 10, 1990. Father John wrote an article entitled Sola Scriptura in the Vanity of Their Minds, which laid out many of the theological reasons for his conversion. The article was published in the Christian Activist in 1995 and then was published in a revised and somewhat expanded form by Conciliar Press in 1996 under the title Sola Scriptura, an Orthodox Analysis of the Cornerstone of Reformation Theology. Father John was a representative of the ROCOR Diocese of Chicago and Mid-America at the signing of the Act of Canonical Communion between the Moscow Patriarchate and the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia in Moscow on May 17, 2007. He is currently the general editor of the St. Innocent Liturgical Calendar. He is also the dean of the Southern Deanery in Texas and Louisiana of the Diocese of Chicago and Mid-America ROCOR. So that's a little bit of his bio there. Also, guys, please hang with me. We're doing the porch stream, so that means airplanes are flying overhead. The mailman might walk up. So thank you guys for hanging with me through that. I don't know if you could hear that plane flying overhead, but it was really loud on my end. Before we get started, everybody, send in your questions, comments, and super chats. All of those will be read live. Follow us on Rumble. Follow us at EPL Clips on YouTube. And that's it. So without further ado, let's bring on our guest today, Father John Whiteford. Thank you so much for being here, Father.
Good to be on your show.
Absolutely. I'm really excited about this. So how was that bio? Did I miss anything there?
I think that covers the most important stuff.
Okay, good. Yeah, my priest was really excited about this today. He's mentioned your work a few times, and so I sprung it on him today. I was like, oh, today's the day. So he was really excited. He asked me, Father Andrew Hammond, he asked me to just tell you thank you, and he really appreciates your work, and thank you for being a bold voice out there and speaking the truth, and really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So I'm curious to hear a little bit about your personal journey. Like how could you go into a little bit of detail of how you discovered Orthodoxy and maybe how you found yourself, in the church?
Well, I wrote a very long article on the subject that you can read if you're interested, called Pilgrims Public. But I was raised in the Church of the Nazarene. I, like many people, strayed from my faith when I was around high school age, but then returned to it and was studying to be a Nazarene minister. And then I started reading the Fathers of the Church. And it's sort of a long story as to how all that worked out. But to make a long story short, I came to the realization that if the church has always believed something, that it would have to be true. And so I started looking at the things that were different between Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. I mean, excuse me, Orthodoxy and Protestantism.
Right.
Because I've met an Orthodox priest through my involvement in the pro-life movement, and I attended a service at his church. And at first, I was just kind of curious about Orthodoxy and started reading some Orthodox material. But then I started thinking, well, this is pretty cool, but then I've got these 5 objections that Protestants typically have. So I started asking the question, has the church always believed these things? And gradually, as I started digging into it, one of those objections went by the wayside after another until I didn't have any more objections. And then I decided to talk to my wife about it. So she was a little bit behind the curve because I didn't talk to her about it at all until I was sure that's what I wanted to do.
Right.
So I converted in 1990, and my wife converted in 1991. And we were in Oklahoma at the time. That's where I went to school, although we met each other in the Houston area, and got married here. And so we moved back here after I finished school, started attending the local Rokor parish, which was, at the time we moved here, was the only Rokor parish in Texas. Now there are about 10 or 11 parishes. But it was the parish we converted in Oklahoma City was much more English speaking. This one was much more Russian. And so it was a bit of an adjustment. But eventually I was made a reader and then a deacon. I served there as a deacon for about 3.5 years. And then we got a blessing to start a mission. And then I was ordained a priest a couple years after that. And so we started off in the room that I'm sitting in, and which is not very big. And now we have a church, and we have on an average Sunday probably around 130 to 140 people.
Yeah, I heard you speak about that on another video. How you started out in this a very small parish where you said there was only like maybe 2 or 3 people, and now you're talking about expanding. What a great thing to hear. Yeah, that's awesome. And it is interesting. You talked about how you had these 5 issues when you were converting from Protestantism. It's interesting to me how so many of us have the same hangups coming from an American culture, largely Protestant culture. We have the hangups about the saints or the veneration of icons, or maybe about the Theotokos. These same issues always seem to pop up when I'm showing people the church or when new people are coming in. It's kind of interesting to me how I think our culture plays a large part in that. The way that we're raised, and it's just exotic and different from what we're used to.
Well, even though we live in a mostly post-Christian culture at this point, it's still sort of deeply influenced by Protestantism. And if you were raised a Protestant, particularly a Protestant evangelical, you were probably raised with a lot of anti-Roman Catholic apologetics. And so when you encounter Orthodoxy, your first reaction is, oh, well, this seems kind of like the Roman Catholics. But then you start to realize that it's different.
Right.
But then you have the typical Protestant objections that you have to work your way through and ask yourself, are these objections really rooted in Scripture and tradition, or are they just some late Protestant thing that the early church didn't agree with?
Right. Yeah, we've spoken on that a few times here on this channel. Is not only is it that sort of anti-Roman Catholicism aspect of it, but sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, there's definitely a very much an anti-Roman Catholic, especially with the Theotokos and this and the icons. That's
Right, right,
two things that I've noticed in my own life that just keep popping up. But also, oh, that's what I was going to say. Also, so it's not just that, but it's also this sort of rebellious American culture that we have too, right? There's this rebellion and this submission and obedience is like a four-letter word in America. It seems like,
right,
a lot of people, they have it just turns them off immediately when they hear about hierarchy and a priest. I think in a more Protestant way, like that's less of a hierarchy. The pastor, he's sort of the
right,
same as everybody else, and in Orthodoxy we have a very like clear hierarchy. I think that bothers a lot of people.
right. Well, it's the same kind of a spirit that you find in the books of Moses, where you have Dathan and Abiram rebelling against Moses, saying, "You take too much on yourself, Moses. All the congregation is holy. We're all equal. Everybody wants to make that argument. The people who are usually making the argument are the ones that want to take the place of the people who are in the hierarchy that they are objecting to. So there's always going to be a hierarchy whenever human beings get together. It's gonna happen, and we can pretend that it doesn't happen, or we can actually have a hierarchy that's based on scripture and tradition.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it always comes up, even in social circles and things. Usually, there's one person that's going to pop up as a leader, or one person that's going to direct things, and that's sort of just this social hierarchy that exists. And at least in the church, we have our reasons why this person has studied and has been appointed, and then you've got of course apostolic succession as well, which gives it like legitimacy. And the
Right,
hierarchy is so important in the church,
right,
and I think that's a really refreshing thing. It's sort of that double-edged sword where, for some people, the exoticness and the differentness of Orthodoxy can be something that sort of is a stumbling block for them or something to get over. And then for some of us, it's so refreshing when we see that, when we see this is nothing like what we have, had our whole lives and we're so unfulfilled with and unhappy
right.
with. So I think that's interesting how it goes both ways. So when I was talking to my priest and I asked him, I said, "What are some things you'd like us to talk about?" He mentioned about sort of the UFO push in the media, right, and how we're seeing all over like the news and stuff this UFO agenda, I guess, being pushed, and it's all over the news. Everybody's talking aliens, aliens, and he talked about how they've even they'll even call them like interdimensional beings, right, as opposed to extraterrestrial. And so, what's a little bit of your take on that? Why do you think that they're talking about this now, or what are some maybe comments you have about that whole subject?
Well, it's really an interesting time when you get to the point where people who are usually labeled conspiracy theorists are saying this UFO stuff is a bunch of crap, and the people in the mainstream media are saying, "Oh, there are UFOs."
Right,
It's the exact opposite of what you would expect.
right,
And I think that people who want to understand UFOs probably should read Father Seraphim Rose's Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. He talked about it back then and pointed out how this fascination with UFOs was leading people to open themselves up to demonic activity. And what he is pointing out, if you think about it just in terms of practical reality, let's assume that there maybe are lives, people, or some sort of beings on another planet somewhere in the universe. The nearest star is still a long ways away from Earth, and so if UFOs are constantly flying to Earth, they've got a lot of time on their hands and a lot of excess capacity to travel across light years of distance. It doesn't really make sense. It does start to make sense when you get into the interdimensional being side of this whole thing, where you start talking about, well, maybe these beings are, not really just flying across the universe like you might think that UFOs do, but maybe they're just from another dimension. Well, maybe we're talking about demons. Maybe that's what they are.
right.
And that's basically what Father Seraphim Rose suggests. And I think people who are opening themselves up to this the whole idea is there is a desire to seek some sort of a solution to all of our problems by UFOs showing up and just telling us how to make everything right.
Right.
Um,
I think it's pretty revealing how a lot of when you start to look into the sort of UFO culture and these sort of conventions that they'll hold at these hot spots of UFO activity, it's always like new agey hippie type things with crystals and
right.
all this stuff, and ties in with the psychedelic drug usage. And there's lots of people out there that believe that you can contact extraterrestrials or these interdimensional beings through this psychedelic drug usage. And I think that's very revealing, right? Because that's so clearly demonic when looked at it from a Christian lens, especially with
Right.
some of the experiences that people report having, where they talk about how we're all one and we're all one with nature, and dissolve the ego and all these things. This is all clearly like anti-Christ, anti-Christian doctrine, and so it would make perfect sense why it would come from a demon. That they never talk about Christ, they never say, hey, go to the church. It's always you're one, you're God, you are the universe, bro, like that kind of stuff. So I think it's really I completely agree with you on the UFO phenomena being a demonic phenomena for sure.
Right.
Yeah. So another thing I wanted to talk about was sort of you've written a lot of good articles for your blog, and then a few of them have been featured on Patristic Faith as well. We actually read that 4-part article that you did on a previous stream where we were talking about LGBT and the Pride movement and all that stuff.
Right.
That was a really good article. I wanted to talk a little bit about that because that's such a prevalent topic today. It's so heavily pushed in modern culture, and especially the month of June. I mean, it's so hard to figure out how to navigate this, I guess. And it's not that hard. I mean, just speak the truth and love the people. But what's your advice for people maybe dealing with that in their own personal lives, maybe in their family, friend, loved one, somebody going through that, who's just they don't have a Christian phronema, they're in a whole different world. Like, how do you even begin to bridge that gap?
Well, it depends on where people are. I mean, you have to start where they're at and work from there. But I think what people need to understand is that a lot of what we're seeing today is something that you did not see 30 years ago.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, not to say that, I mean, obviously there have been people who were homosexuals for a long time, but when you start getting into transgender, this, bisexual, that,
Furries.
furries, the 72 genders,
Yeah.
this is all new stuff, and none of it is healthy.
Right.
We as time has gone on, I think as a culture, we've become a little bit more aware of the fact that if you eat food that's made by artificial ingredients, that could be the cause of a lot of health problems. And so we're into organic food. We want to have all natural food, all natural ingredients. We know what? There's only one kind of organic sexuality.
Right.
And that's a man and a woman. You look at your body, you take an anatomy class, and you're going to find out that your genitalia were designed for heterosexual activity. They were not designed for sodomy. And if you look at the health results that homosexuals and other kinds of people on the alphabet spectrum have, they're not good. And so I think that people who care about other people who are struggling with these things shouldn't just affirm them any more than you would affirm someone who was doing drugs or alcohol and was an alcoholic. You wouldn't say, oh, well, you're okay. Just go ahead and keep getting plastered.
Right.
And don't go to work.
Right.
Just go ahead and do more drugs. It'll be okay. We affirm you. We love you. No, you wouldn't say that, because you would know that that's a road that's going to lead to their early death. That's going to destroy them.
That's the metaphor I always use whenever I'm talking to people about this, and they always say, "No, it's not the same thing." And I say, "Well, it's still a self-destructive behavior," and I guess that's the difference. Is that they don't view this as a self-destructive behavior, which I think it's just basic biology, like you said. I mean, it's not a healthy lifestyle at all, and they also they're just coming from a completely different mindset, a completely different world. It's really shocking. I mean, just like the video I recently did all about a Christian perspective on Pride Month, I had people telling me that was so hateful. That was so hateful. And the whole video, I'm saying we should love these people, and that we get criticized for not loving these people, and sometimes maybe that criticism is right for certain people. Maybe sometimes it's too easy to point the finger and to hate, right, and to forget that we're supposed to love these people.
Right.
But that, just the fact that I don't affirm it, and just the fact that I say, here's why I don't believe this is good or healthy, and that the loving thing is to say, hey, you're hurting yourself, stop. That's hateful, in a
Right.
modern person's eyes, which it's like it confounds me. I don't even know what to do besides pray and say, like, God bless. Like, I don't know.
Well, another analogy, which is actually far more natural, but it's still wrong and destructive, is, I've dealt with people who were married, but their marriage wasn't going well, and then suddenly they have this desire to be in a relationship with someone that they're not married to, of the opposite sex, and they want to divorce their spouse and go marry this other person.
Right.
Well, as a Christian, I can't say, you know what, God bless you. That's good. If you've discovered that you really don't love this person and this other person would be better for you, that's wonderful. Go for it, because that's contrary to the teachings of Scripture.
Right.
There are only very limited reasons why a divorce would ever be allowable, and it's never a good thing. And so it's always something that we should try to avoid. And everybody in the church should try to encourage a married couple to stay together and to make a go of it, even if it's difficult.
Yeah.
But
I think it comes down to definitions, right? What is love? Because they use that argument for the LGBT. Well, two people just want to love each other, then let them love each other. It's like they conflate passion and physical attraction with actual love.
right, because if you really love them in the sense that a Christian would love somebody, and then loving them would mean that you would not lead them down the path that would lead them into a self-destructive lifestyle of sin,
Right.
and separation from God.
Right.
So love is great. You can love everybody, and you should. You're supposed to.
Yeah.
And nobody's against love, but people are against perversion and perverse passions. And St. Paul in Romans chapter 1 talks about it as being contrary to nature. That's right there in the Scriptures. And you have Protestants and even some people in the Orthodox Church that want to dance around the clear teachings of Scripture, and also the canons of the Church, the writings of the saints, that say that these things are absolutely not allowable, that they're an abomination. But there they are, and there's no ambiguity about it. Some Protestants try to act like, they're these words that we just really don't know what they mean. Well, you know what? They're Greek-speaking people in the church till today.
Right.
And there's never been any doubt about what these words mean. If you go ask a Greek-speaking person what a malaki is, they could tell you.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And these words are not obscure. That it's not like the Greek language ceased to be spoken at some point, and we just maybe forgot what these words meant. These are just people who are just trying to obfuscate the truth because they don't want to deal with the truth.
Right. Yeah.
But the Scriptures are ambiguous.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that's probably a big reason why they prefer the sort of open field Protestantism, whatever your interpretation is, that'll go, because it's too rigid. When you actually get to the meaning of why are the words that they are, what did the church always teach? Like, once you get down to definitions, it's like it's uncomfortable, because that means that you have to do actual work. You have to actually submit. You have to actually try and struggle and try to follow the teachings, and that's difficult. And so people,
Right.
I think, are more comfortable just sort of, because if it's up to your interpretation, it's whatever you want. There is no work there. It's just like, if something's too hard, it's like, that's probably not what it means. It probably means this other thing. So there's that. And then you mentioned about how you've got divorce rates even amongst heterosexual couples, and about the loving thing. I heard a priest, I forget who it was, but they talked about, if you're in a marriage and you feel like you're not getting enough love, it's probably because you're not giving enough love, right? And so people, oh, well, the neighbor makes me feel very sexy, and so I'm gonna go with him now because the passion has waned or whatever, or because I don't feel like I'm getting enough love out of this relationship. Well, love is supposed to be a selfless thing where we give of ourselves and we empty ourselves for another person. It's like, maybe you should try that.
Yeah, part of the problem is that Hollywood and Madison Avenue have helped us to confuse love with the bubbly feelings that you have when you're infatuated with somebody or sexually attracted to them, and they're not the same. And if you start dating somebody, you have these feelings, but you know what? Eventually those feelings are not going to be there like they were when you first started dating, because that's just not the way we're made. We don't feel that way forever. And if that's the only basis of your relationship's not going to last. But if you actually choose to love your spouse, you can eventually develop a love that goes far deeper than anything you could have imagined. But
Right.
it's not the same as it was when you were teenagers and you were just holding hands for the first time in the theater or something like that.
Right.
But it becomes something a whole lot deeper and better.
Yeah.
But we're told in scripture that we're supposed to love our enemies. So if you ever say, I don't love my wife or my husband anymore, that's because you chose to stop loving them, not
Right.
because the feeling went away, because love is not a feeling. Love is a choice.
Right. And as
And
Christians, we understand that. And
right,
it's really sad. Now you're seeing so far this culture has come that there's people they don't even, because they understand that those feelings wane, those passions wane. Now they think that, marriage and just a monogamous relationship doesn't even make sense anymore. And you see the polyamory and stuff because those feelings wane. You're supposed to bop around to a bunch of different people. It's so sad because as Christians, like you said, we understand that that's just passion and that there's something deeper there.
the thing of it is, though, is that even if you were just a hedonist and you were seeking the greatest amount of pleasure that you could possibly get, even hedonists came to the realization that going down that path of just pursuing pleasure for its own sake and not having any boundaries to it didn't work. That eventually you start getting into pain and misery
Right.
when you go down that road. So even hedonists started to realize that there has to be some borders here. We can't just do whatever we want to do.
Yeah, maybe being 60 years old, having 6 kids around you at Christmas time is actually more pleasurable than being 60 years old with STDs alone in an apartment, like maybe.
Exactly. And I can tell you, I've got 2 grandkids right now and another one on the way. And I loved having kids. I enjoyed my children very much, raising them. But grandkids are on a whole nother level. And if you talk to any grandparent that's really having a relationship with their grandkids, you're going to find that they'll say that. It's almost like having kids is just a means to get to the grandkid stage, because that's really where the real joy.
Yeah, that's the reward.
Right. But if you're just hooking up and you're not having any serious relationships, you're never going to have that. The thing is, the day's going to come when your value on the meat market sexually is a lot lower than it used to be,
Right.
and you're just not going to be able to continue to engage in that kind of behavior. And if you never had a serious relationship that resulted in you producing life, you're just going to have a very long, lonely old age that's going to be death.
Right. And we know that, the hookup culture and stuff, this actually damages people, not only physically, but emotionally as well. It hardens their heart, makes it hard to ever trust another person because no matter what, if you're sleeping with somebody, you're developing that bond. And then when they leave, that's like a trauma on your heart. And eventually it gets to the point where you can't trust people. And it's very shallow, surface level, hollow
Right.
relationships you're having.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a shame. And so we talked about the LGBT and sort of the problem with marriage and divorce. I think that men, women, relationships, it's all sort of messed up now in today's day and age. You've got problems with feminism and then the manosphere, right? It's like two ends of the same coin. You've got the toxic femininity and toxic masculinity. And it seems like our culture has lost sight of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. I personally think, and I'm sure we're in agreement on this, that it comes from people's lack of place in the church. They're not taught the sort of basic gender roles that you know this is expected of a man, this is expected of a woman.
Right.
And so it's up for grabs, whatever you think it is. And so and people always want to have that victim identification. So if you're a woman, you're being oppressed by the patriarchy, that's why you're not rich and happy. And if you're a man, it's because all these terrible toxic women out there, online dating has given them too much power and they don't treat me right, and that's why I'm not thriving in life. I think that's we're seeing a really sad state for men and women. And personally, I think the answer is the church, because then things are put in its proper place.
Yeah, the key is if you want to have a healthy traditional marriage, first of all, you need to be a healthy traditional person. And then you need to try to find another healthy traditional person. But the first thing you got to work on is in yourself, because it's not like if you're, just a modern man that's living for the world and just hoping that you're somehow going to find this traditional virgin that's going to step into your life and you're going to marry her and raise a bunch of children together. Why would she be looking at a guy like you if you're not living the kind of a life that she's been raised to believe it would be the makings of a good husband?
Right.
So
yeah, people want that perfect girl to just fall from the sky,
Right. So you got to work on yourself, and then you're most likely going to find that traditional woman in the church, and that's really the best place to go looking. That they are out there. It's it's harder in this country, in this culture where we have so many people who were raised in with feminist ideology, but you can still find traditional women, and that's what you need to do. And when you get on the same page and you get married, it can work. I feel sorry for there are men who've been burned, and they get on social media and basically say the only thing for men is to go have surrogate children,
right?
So you can raise them yourself, so you don't have to worry about these horrible women abusing you. That is not that. There's no way an Orthodox Christian could say that would be a solution, and
right.
And you would be intentionally robbing your children of a mother, and children need a father, and they also need a mother. So we see in our society mostly the damage that results from men not being in the picture and people not having fathers actively involved in their life. But it's also robbing a child if you do the reverse and you deprive them of a mother. Children need both.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think a big part of men struggling in the dating sphere too is with the technology and stuff. So many young men don't know how to talk to women, right? Because in high school, maybe they only have a couple of friends, or they only have guy friends. When I was growing up in high school, I had a bunch of different, platonic women as friends, and that helped me learn how to talk to women, and understand what makes them happy. What do they like? What do they don't like? And I look around to some of my younger friends or family, and I'm like, man, you need to like have a friend that's a woman so that you can like learn how to talk to women, because it's such an important thing. And people go through their childhood not getting that. Now they're on their computer, they're in their room or in the basement, and then they just go online and it's just a recipe for disaster.
Right. In terms of raising children, I think that any parent that gives your kids a smartphone is doing them a great disservice. I really don't think a child should have a smartphone until they're 18 or pretty close thereto.
Yeah.
Because they need to learn how to function as a normal human being in the natural world, not in the virtual world.
A lot of adults don't even know how to do that anymore.
Right. Well, and the thing, I can tell you that I encounter more and more people who are of a certain age. They're, the younger people that I encounter, there's more and more of them that have a really hard time engaging in a conversation. And you can see it's very painful for them because they're so shy face to face, because their only interaction with other people is on social media. And so you're really hamstringing children by letting that be the way they develop socially, because it's easy to learn how to use social media if you're a normal human being. It's easy to learn how to use a computer.
Right.
Most people of my generations, we didn't grow up with these things, and so we had to learn them, but we learned how to use them okay. Right. And anybody can learn how to use this stuff, but you need to learn how to be a human being first.
Yeah.
And one advice that I give to a lot of single guys that are looking for an Orthodox wife, I encourage them to cultivate relationships with elderly women. Because number one, they'll do what you're talking about, which is they'll just learn how to talk to women.
Yeah.
But the thing is if they get to know elderly women love to matchmake.
Oh yeah.
And they often have daughters or granddaughters that they're looking to matchmake with.
Right.
So I think that's a good way to kill two birds with one stone, so to
Sure.
speak.
And I think a lot of times too, people are way too focused on finding a partner, when they should be more focused on living a sacramental life within the church and just living a Christian life, because then those things will fall into place. If you're going to church every Sunday and you're staying after for coffee hour and you're talking to the people at your parish, you're gonna make friends with the elderly. Well, that stuff is just natural to the life of the church, right? And
Well, and the other thing is you need to be in a position to actually get married before you start seriously looking for a wife.
right.
Because what are you doing if you're not going to be if you're at a point in your life where you're not going to be able to get married for the next 4 years, it probably would be better for you to not really worry about dating until you get to that point where you're ready to start getting married, or at least pretty close to that point, so that you can actually be at a point where you can start talking real business.
Right.
If you get a woman who's interested.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that comes down to a lack of faith as well. That people feel like they have to force some sort of situation. They're not trusting that God's going to sort of put it together when the time's right. As long as you have the proper social skills, as long as when they show up, you can actually talk to them.
Right.
It's kind of important. Um, what is some advice you'd have for inquirers, catechumens, new converts, people approaching the church from an American perspective?
Well, read books by reputable authors, and especially the saints. If somebody has an ST in front of their name, they're the better authority than someone has a DR in front of their name.
Right.
But look for reputable sources about the faith and read what they have to say, and also try to find a good, healthy parish and plug in, because it's one thing to study orthodoxy in the abstract, but orthodoxy is not an abstraction. Orthodoxy is a life that you have to actually enter into, and you can only do that in a parish.
Yeah. That's a really important point. A lot of people, especially with online now, and I mean, obviously I love the online Orthodox work that has brought so many people in, but it becomes such this intellectual, abstract concept, and
Right,
it's hard for people to transition into a lived experience.
right.
I've known a lot of people, and myself included, for a time where I believed in the church, I believed in Orthodoxy, but I wasn't going to a parish. And there's sort of this weird rut you can get into where it's all chat rooms and YouTube or whatever, and you're not actually going. And so I think that's a really good
I
good
think
advice.
it's great that people are discovering orthodoxy online, and when I meet people who are interested in orthodoxy that come to my parish, I usually ask them how they found out about orthodoxy or what got them interested. And it's amazing to me how often it's because they discovered it online. They discovered it on YouTube, watching Jay Dyer or
Right.
some other Orthodox figure like Roosh or something like that.
Right.
And so that's all good, because if they didn't know about Orthodoxy, they wouldn't be interested.
Right.
But you have to go beyond just hearing about it and thinking about it and actually doing it.
Yeah.
And that's where the parish comes in.
I recently met somebody at my parish, a new person coming around, and he said he found out about Orthodoxy through TikTok. I was like, that's a first. I've never met anybody that came to the church from TikTok, but glory to God. I mean, he's using everything.
Right.
So we got an $8 super chat from our friend Maddie over at Digital Minefield. Thank you so much, Matt. He says, does Father John have plans to ever write a book?
Well, I would love to, and I'm probably going to do it at some point. But I'll tell you, one of the things that's kept me from doing it is when I discovered the wonders of hyperlinked text.
Oh.
Because I started writing articles for web pages, and it really is a great asset to be able to hyperlink to other stuff that's out there on the internet. And you can't do that in a book. But I've been needing to get Sola Scriptura back into print, and I want to revise and expand it. So that is something that I want to do, and I might write something else. There was a project that I was wanting to write for a long time, and then Father Josiah Trenum basically beat me to the punch, because Rock and Sand is basically what I wanted to write.
It's so good.
But he beat me to it. So
Yeah, I highly recommend anybody coming from a Protestant background to definitely read Father Josiah Trenum's book, and his YouTube channel is great too, man. What such a great priest, Father
Right.
Josiah is.
He's wonderful.
Yeah, there's so many great Orthodox. I don't want to use the word influencers, but Orthodox clergy who are out there doing the work yourself. Father Zachariah Lynch, you and Zachariah Lynch, Father Zachariah Lynch, are two of my favorite online bloggers, I guess you call it. I
Yeah.
think your guys' writing is really good. Um, but there's so many great people out there. What are some of the channels that you personally like?
Well, I like listening to Father Josiah Trenum.
Mm,
Um, I'm trying to think of who I normally listen to. There's so many channels that I do listen to. I listen to Jay Dyer some. I used to not listen to him at all, and I was kind of put off by some of his style. But I started after I had so many people telling me that that's how I discovered Orthodoxy. I started to listen to more of his shows and making more of an effort to listen to it, and and I found that a lot of it's very insightful,
yeah,
and so it's good. I might get some boos and hisses from some people who like Jay Dyer, but I listen to stuff on Ancient Faith Radio. I listen to Father Andrew Damick and
right,
also Father Stephen DeYoung, the Lord of Spirits.
right.
I've been meaning to write a review of that
I,
podcast as well
I
as
hear
the book.
great things about that podcast. I haven't listened to it myself, but I get so many people recommending Lord of Spirits to me.
Yeah, I have a few quibbles with some of the stuff that they say and do, but on the whole, I think that it's certainly more good than bad. It's got a lot of people interested in Scripture,
Right. Well,
and
that's the thing online is people are always looking for somebody perfect, and that's why I defend Jay a lot over here. I think he's a really good guy, but people, whenever somebody's in the arena, whenever somebody's putting their face out there and doing work, people are always going to detract on them because they're not perfect, and it's like it just comes from I think this Western idea of like the Ubermensch and wanting to
yeah,
put people on pedestals and celebrity and all this stuff, and it's like these are just people, like yes, we all
right.
have flaws, if you know that going into it then you're not surprised. It's like, okay, yeah, this guy, can get grumpy or this guy can be whatever. It's like, so what? So
Yeah,
can
I mean,
you.
I think you have to get to the point where you're able to take what is good from somebody and ignore the stuff that you think is not so good.
Right.
Like Father Alexander Schmemann, he's no longer with us, of course, but he wrote a lot of books, and one of the first books I read after I became Orthodox was his Introduction to Liturgical Theology, and it actually turned my stomach
Mm,
because it sounded exactly like the liberal Protestant biblical scholarship that I'd spent 4 years reading in a Protestant school.
yeah.
And so I started that book, and I just had to put it down and stop reading it.
Yeah.
But then I picked it back up maybe 5-10 years later and read it
Mm,
again, finished it, and I found there were useful stuff in there. I mean, I saw the same thing I saw initially, which is that there's definitely this Western scholastic or academic approach that somehow thinks that we have the technology. We understand things on a much deeper level than anyone that's ever come before us.
yeah.
But there are good insights in his books, and he's got books like his book on Great Lent that I think is a wonderful book that I recommend to people without
Good.
any reservations. There are some of his books that I would say maybe if you're not prepared to be discerning, you should ignore.
Right.
But he's got good stuff, and there's lots of writers like that where they're worth reading, but maybe there's a few things about what they're saying or doing that's not so good.
Well, isn't that
Uh,
how it's always been? I
right,
mean, you've got no saint is infallible, right? And so you'd think that every
right,
saint, there's going to be something in there that, isn't 100%.
right.
I'm sorry. I got a really loud plane. Can you hear that?
Yeah, we could hear it.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay,
it's okay.
I'm so sorry. I've heard when I was speaking with Living Orthodoxy, Father McHale, he talked about how what's his name, Origen, right? He's got some good commentaries on the Old Testament, right? Even though he's like a heretic, even though obviously he wouldn't accept everything, but he says, oh, but over here, this one thing he wrote was really good, right? And so you have to be discerning anytime. And I've heard the metaphor used, be the bee, right? The bee that goes to the flower and gathers the pollen, as opposed to the fly that we won't say. You want to be the bee, right? And
Right,
and
right.
go and take what's good. yeah, I definitely think that there's so much good out there, and nowadays I'm just much more uh, willing to be charitable when we look at things like with all of the attacks coming at the church. Whenever I find anybody who's not doing that, I'm usually more charitable, right? I'm
Yeah,
talking more about like public orthodoxy or the Fordham,
yeah,
all that kind of stuff that seems so openly subversive and sort of the way I see it, like a directed attack. It's like we're gonna try to get in there, infiltrate, subvert, and destroy from within.
right,
And then you've got other people who are sincere and they actually love the truth and they're just trying their best, but they might maybe have some bad takes at times, right?
right, right.
What are you wrote a an article about public orthodoxy when I was going through your stuff on patristic faith. I saw that, and
I've written more than a few.
I'm sure you have.
They just put too much stuff out for me to keep up with all the nonsense that they publish. But
yeah, I
you
had
know,
a caller recently ask me, explain Fordham. We've done a few videos going into the Fordham University and all that. What are your takes on that?
well,
I
when
know
you
you've
look
done a
at
lot.
there were a couple of videos that came out a while back about how you have these foundation money, play, the kind of different foundations that fund subversive scholarship in religious organizations. Jay did a great show on this topic.
Yes.
And I think the Fordham folks are a classic example of that because they're getting a lot of money from somewhere. And when you look at their articles, they publish an article, then they'll have it translated into several languages,
Mm,
and that's not something that somebody's doing on a shoestring. There's somebody giving them money to make that happen.
right.
And there's some other folks out there that are doing similar kind of stuff that wind up getting grants to fund their work. Whereas no one's ever given me a grant to go get a PhD and
Right.
or anything like that. No one's given a grant to Jay Dyer
Right.
to do that kind of stuff from these foundations because they're promoting a particular agenda.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
When people pay money, they expect something for that money. They're
right.
buying something.
And the thing is, it's not like they're bribing people who are otherwise perfectly orthodox and then turning them into liberals.
Right.
They're looking for people who are already inclined in that direction, and they're choosing to fund them, but they're not choosing to fund people who are more conservative.
Right.
And there's some great scholars out there, like Tikhon Pino is a great scholar who I happen to know personally.
Right.
Um, he's got all the credentials. He's got a PhD. He's a scholar on Saint Gregory Palamas. He's read a great dissertation on the energy's essence distinction.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I know, he's not getting any grant money from George Soros to advance his scholarship,
Right.
and I don't suspect he probably will.
Right. Yeah, the video you were talking about, in case anybody was curious, was how religious institutions are subverted, state intelligence and foundation funding. That's definitely a great video that everybody should check out if they're interested in that topic, because there's certainly a lot to be said there. There was a documentary recently we watched on the channel. Um, oh man, what is it called? It's, the Subversion of American Orthodoxy, something like that, and it goes really in depth with the foundation funding and the money behind it, and that's kind of it's not scary, but it's very telling, to see that. I mean, of course it would be this way, right? It's the true church. Of course, the enemy's got the target right on the church. That's the goal, right? Is to try to destroy this. Now,
What's kind of interesting about that is that there were a whole series of videos that came out around the same time, and some of them just focused on what are these whack out liberals doing.
mm,
And then there was this video that came out that said, where are they getting their money? Well, the video that was focused on what are these whacked out liberals doing, those videos are still up on YouTube. But the
yeah,
one that exposed where the money was coming from, that one got
oh,
taken down. That one you
and
can only watch on Rumble.
that's the one we watched on my channel, because I noticed that. I said, okay, this isn't on YouTube, so I guess I'll take the arrows and I'll put it on my channel and on
Right.
YouTube. And it hasn't gotten taken down yet, but now that I said that, who knows? But yeah, absolutely. Everybody should go check out that Rumble documentary, because it's
Right.
really good. But that's very telling, like you said, that's the one that gets pulled, of course, and
Right.
of course it would be that way. You've spoken about the baptism and the reception of converts. And that's also something that my priest had mentioned to me. Is he said, the church is the vine, and with this baptism, what's the word? It's sort of controversial, I guess, the whole baptism thing. I know Father Peter Hears has gotten a lot of flack for talking about it, but the way my priest described it was like they want to say like Roman Catholicism is part of the vine, but that vine's been cut, so it's not the same. What
Right.
are your thoughts on baptism and how we should be receiving converts and things like economia? Is it really necessary in today's day and age? When can it go too far? Things like that.
Well, obviously, the canons talk about applying economia, so it's not an inherently bad thing or liberal or anything like that, but it's all a question of when is it appropriate. And if you listen to some of the people on the other end of this discussion that are vociferous opponents of people like Father Peter Hears or myself, and Father Peter Hears and I actually disagree on the question of what do you do with someone who was received by chrismation that maybe shouldn't have been. Because I would say if they were received by chrismation and their bishop blessed it, that even though maybe that shouldn't have been what happened, that they're still in the church, and so there's no need for a corrective baptism. But if you look at Ben Cabe, he flat out says that he thinks that Roman Catholics are, have grace-filled sacraments and they're part of the church. So that's the reason why he thinks that it's wrong.
Well, Father, I don't know if you've ever done this, but the people like Ben Cabe, the people like Michael Lofton over at Reason and Theology, I know he is Roman Catholic. If you go into his YouTube comments, I mean, it'll just make you want to throw up. Like the entire thing is full of Roman Catholics, but also full of Orthodox that are 100% ecumenism. That's good. This is the goal, and they're just open about it. And that's honestly, that's mind blowing to me. There's so many people out there that really believe in this, and want to see it happen.
Yeah, the bottom line of it is what does baptism do? Baptism unites you to the church. So if someone is baptized outside of the church, then obviously it did not do that. And if it did do that, then there wouldn't be any reason to talk about how to receive them because they'd already be in the church. So there wouldn't be any need to receive them. So if you need to receive somebody, it's only because they're outside of the church. And if they're outside of the church, that means their baptism maybe had the correct form, maybe it didn't. But it's still not it's not a sacrament of the church. It didn't unite them to the church, which is the chief thing that baptism does.
Right.
And so it's not that.
Right. It seems to be the main question is there sacraments outside the church, right? Isn't that really the main question of it?
Right. And we would say that there are forms of sacraments outside of the church, and in some cases they're close enough in form to ours where we can receive them by economia. And St. Augustine actually used the best analogy, in my opinion, to explain how this works, because what he said was, in the Roman military, if you were a soldier, you had a tattoo, and the tattoo said what legion you belonged to. And he said you could have that tattoo illicitly two different ways. You could be a deserter, so maybe you started off in the army and now you left the army. You still got the tattoo, but you've severed your relationship with the army. So it doesn't have the meaning that it once had.
Right.
The other way is you could just gone down to the tattoo shop and say, "Hey, give me one of those Legionnaire tattoos. I think that's cool."
Yeah.
Well, what he says is if you had a tattoo that was given to you at the tattoo shop just because you thought that it was cool, but it was actually done right, and then you went and joined the Roman army, there wouldn't be a need for you to get another tattoo because that tattoo would now have the meaning that went along with what it signified.
Sure.
And to put it in more modern terms, you have people who pretend to be Marines, run around in a dress blue Marine uniform. The uniform could be absolutely correct, but if they're not in the Marine Corps, it doesn't mean anything. It's fake.
Mm-hmm.
But if they join the Marine Corps and they have a real dress blue uniform, there's no reason why they would have to get another one.
So then I guess the question is, what is it that gives the validity of the thing?
It's the reception by the church. Right. That's the key thing. And the other thing of it is when you're talking about receiving people by economia today, there are very few groups outside of the Orthodox Church that still baptize people with the correct form, really.
Right.
Because their correct form is triple immersion baptism. So aside from Copts and Armenians who are Monophysites, and maybe some Uniates, even though most Uniates fudge on that one because they don't do full immersion baptisms,
right.
but let's assume for the sake of argument that at least some of them do. Aside from them, there's no group out there that's really baptizing people in the correct form. Now, Roman Catholics baptize babies by pouring, and you could make the case, well, pouring is an acceptable way in an emergency, so maybe even though they shouldn't do it all the time, it's still a correct form.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I can go with you there, and say, okay, well, at least we could receive somebody like that by economia. We're not obligated to, according to St. Basil's first canon, but we can.
Right. But why would you when you can just as easily baptize them the right way, and in the church, right? That's the question I have is like, who elects to not be baptized? I'm not talking about somebody that's like, 85 years old, they're on death's door or something. Like, you're just in the church, right? Oh, I got my, Protestant baptism, but I don't feel it just seems like the wrong mindset to me. I mean, I know nothing, but from my perspective, it's like, why wouldn't you
Well,
take the sacrament?
there are some circumstances in which it would make sense. I mean, I had a case where I had a wife who had children, and she and her children all wanted to become Orthodox, but her husband, who was a continuing Anglican, was not okay with them being received by baptism. He was okay with them becoming Orthodox. He wasn't okay with them being received by baptism. And so to keep peace in the family, I got the bishop's blessing to receive them by chrismation. And they had all been baptized as continuing Anglicans. And so they were baptized at least with something that was an arguably correct form. You also do have cases where people are elderly and it makes sense. But St. Basil talks about how receiving somebody by economia sometimes is a way of getting past them putting off baptism out of indolence. In other words, they have a hesitation about being received by baptism. But if you receive them by economia, you're able to push them over the wire. Well, I've had a case like that. And, someone was kind of teetering on the brink for a very long time. And because of a number of circumstances I won't go into, it made sense. But as a rule, I agree that it doesn't make sense to baptize everybody. I mean, to receive everybody by chrismation. And I've never met anybody who was received by chrismation that later on regretted it. But I have met more than a few people who were received by chrismation that later on regretted it.
Yeah, that's what I often say too, is people don't regret getting baptized in the Orthodox Church, right? And as you said, but I have met people that didn't get baptized who wish they would have. That's definitely a very telling thing. Yeah, I think that I guess I could see the possibility for the abuse of economia, if you'd say, like, people are a little bit too loosey goosey. I mean, I've known parishes that were like that, or priests that were like that, who, they want to shorten the liturgy or take this part out, take that part out, because I don't want to scare people away. We don't want to scare people away with these traditional liturgies, so we'll just shorten everything down. We'll skip this part, skip that part. And I was catechized in a church like that, and I didn't even know I was a catechumen, right? They didn't do the rites of catechesis over me or anything like the exorcism, any of that. I just found out I was a catechumen because we were sitting, during the homily, and they say, "Hey, we have a new catechumen." And I guess that's me. I guess I'm the new catechumen.
Right.
And then when I switched parishes, right around the COVID stuff, that's when I first learned that there was even a rite for catechesis.
Right.
So I think that there's a real temptation to push it way too far and to sort of be lazy about how we're approaching the rights of the church. And I think that's really dangerous, because as Orthodox, we're here to protect the ancient faith and to pass that torch down and to keep it pure. And if we're too loosey goosey with this stuff, like, we could very easily just lose things,
Right. I've had people who started off as catechumens in other jurisdictions, and in every case, I found that they were not really made catechumens. And I remember years ago, there was a discussion on the ROCOR clergy list. How do you make someone a catechumen? And somebody was saying, well, I do it this way, I do it that way. And then this very senior proto-presbyter got on there and he said, well, the question is, how do you make somebody a catechumen? I open up the book of needs and I see the service, the making of a catechumen.
Right.
Well, if you want to make somebody a catechumen, you do the service for the making of a catechumen, and then they're a catechumen.
Right, exactly. And that's I was really grateful that I had switched parishes right around that time, because then I was able to receive the proper, rights that I was
Right.
meant to.
Right.
I've told the story before, but basically the whole deal was that it was right around when all the lockdowns were happening and all the mask stuff was going on, and me and my godfather and a bunch of the people at the parish didn't like all of that. I'm sure you can guess what my position on all that stuff was. But we didn't want to make a problem out of it, and so we didn't want to wear the mask, we didn't want to take the jabs, but we weren't about to judge anybody else or make it a point of contention. And we had basically gotten a letter from the bishop saying, don't make it a point of contention, love each other, pray for each other, and leave it at that, right? And leave it open to personal preference.
Right.
And so we viewed that as a victory. We were like, yes, all right, we can all just love each other and this isn't a problem. And then the priest of that parish, sort of on his own without the bishop, said, nope, if you don't wear a mask, you're not allowed here. And Jerry, I know that you have this baptism scheduled in a few weeks, but if you don't wear a mask at the baptism, we can't do it. So I sat on it for a little while, and my godfather talked about it, and I'm like, I can't. And I really wanted to be baptized. I had worked at it for a year and a half, and so we weren't sure what to do. We weren't sure if we should just like sit outside the church since we're no longer welcome in the church without the mask, or what the proper thing to do is. And then we just so happened to get really lucky and find this Rocourt parish. And we ended up going there and was able to be properly catechized and then, received in baptism. And so I switched from OCA to Rocourt. And that's one thing I really like about Rocourt and why I recommend it, is because they seem less strict on average, or I'm saying more strict on average than the OCA, right? They seem more, they hold to the traditions a little bit tighter. They're not as loosey-goosey as my experience in the OCA. I do know that it's a parish by parish thing, but in my experience, Rocourt's a little bit stricter.
Right. There's a lot more uniformity liturgically and in terms of how everything's done from one Rocourt parish to the other. But, there's going to be some differences.
Right.
And, there are some Rocourt parishes that weren't so great during the COVID thing either. But for the most part, most Rocourt parishes were not sweating that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah, the parish I'm at now is one of the only parishes in this part of the country that didn't shut down, that wasn't doing all that stuff, and that's really shocking. I mean, a lot of Christians, I think, sort of wonder in the time of the Antichrist, like, how is the elect are going to be deceived if they allow themselves to be? How is that possible? And then when we watched 2019 and all that COVID stuff go on, I felt like that it's like, here's how it's possible. Like, we watched them close the churches. We watched them change the way that we do the Eucharist. We watched all of this stuff happen right before our eyes. What can we do as laity to help sort of guard our parishes or protect ourselves against falling into such a thing in the future?
Well, I hope that even the people who did do some stuff that in retrospect wasn't so great learned from it, and that maybe this was God's way of sort of exposing people to where they were and causing them to think about what they need to do when they're faced by similar things in the future. But what I've been telling my people for a long time is you do need to be prepared for the possibility that you may not be able to go to church. And the thing is, if you wind up preparing yourself for that possibility and the day never comes, you're just going to wind up being a very pious Orthodox Christian that gets to die and go to heaven.
Right.
But to use a Hurricane Alley analogy, when you live in an area that's prone for hurricanes, you can't start preparing for the hurricane when they're already announcing that the hurricane is in the Gulf.
Right.
Because then there's nothing available in the stores because everybody cleans those things out. Yep. You can't go get the tree trimmers to come out and trim your trees because they're busy and probably not. They're certainly not going to be trimming trees in the storm.
Right.
You have to prepare before the hurricane's there. And I think when it comes to persecution, you really have to prepare before the persecution surfaces. And what I think people need to be focused on from a church perspective is, what am I going to do if I can't go to church? And right now you have the freedom to buy service books. You have the freedom to learn how to do the services. You have the freedom to learn how to sing the tones, and you can expand your
right? The
Huh?
Typicon. I've heard people mention the Typicon. Basically, like if they were in a situation where they couldn't go to a church, they would pray the Typicon at home. That's something my
Oh,
godfather said.
Typica. The Typicon is a book
Typic.
about the rubrics. The Typica is
Okay.
the service you do in the place of the liturgy.
Okay.
I'm not our parish website. We actually publish the propers for Typica as well as the liturgy.
Okay.
But it would behoove people to learn how to put those services together when the day comes that you might not be able to find that stuff online.
Right.
Because just being dependent on stuff online is not a wise thing, because anything that's online can be taken down tomorrow, and
Absolutely.
and you won't have access to it if you didn't download it to your PC. So getting hard copies of service books and learning how to actually use them, and being prepared to have a church life in your home apart from being able to go to church,
Yeah.
could be the only way you're going to save your family and keep them Christians.
And
So
we're supposed to be doing that already anyways. The church life starts in the home. The home is our, it's our little
right,
church. So that's, I think, essential for any Orthodox Christian, is to have a prayer corner and have a basic working knowledge of these things, like you just said.
right, and old believers obviously they have their issues, but nobody denies that they're pious people.
Right.
And one thing about old believer culture is that, at least among some of them, you're considered to be a man when you have your own set of service books and you know how to use them.
Right.
I think that wouldn't be a bad thing for us to emulate in our culture.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good tradition. That's definitely what I could get behind, for sure.
And the bottom line of it is even if the day never comes when the church is shut down permanently by the government, there will be times when you can't go to church just because you're traveling or whatever, or there's a hurricane blowing or whatever.
Right.
And so learning how to do stuff at home is good. Plus, most parishes don't have daily services, and there might be some service that you would like to do, some saint you'd like to honor, and your parish isn't doing that service. Well, you could do it at home. And so these are all ways that you can prepare yourself, because if your only church life is in your parish and you don't know how to continue that on at home, and then the day comes when you're not able to access that, you're going to be left with what you have.
Right. And there's
And
a lot of people who don't live near a parish too. They could probably benefit from that sort of knowledge,
right.
We've got a comment here, One True Iceman, which I'm sorry, but I take umbrage with that, because I sell ice for a living. That's my job, is I deliver ice. So I don't know what you mean by One True Iceman, but I'm pretty sure I'm a true Iceman too. He says, where can I buy service books, and what are the best ones to buy? Can inquirers and catechumens buy the service books?
Anybody can buy the service books that are available. And there's an article I wrote a long time ago called Practical Tips on Building a Liturgical Library, because a complete set of service books is not cheap.
Mm.
And so I wrote this to sort of give advice to mission parishes that were starting from scratch and saying, here's the most basic things you want to start off with, and then here's where you want to go as you're able to.
Right.
Because there are some books that give you a lot of ability to do a lot of services, and then there are other books that maybe will be sort of on the tail end of your buying spree when you have the money to do it.
It's crazy how expensive the Orthodox library can get. If you want, that set of Church Fathers hardcovers, that's going for crazy expensive now. And some of Father Seraphim Rose's books are almost $1,000 each. Yeah, it can get kind of costly setting up that Orthodox library.
Right.
Yeah, for
But
sure.
if you go to the Practical Tips article, for example, one thing that I point out is there's an old service book, which is not my favorite translation. But if you had to only get one book that had as much as you could possibly fit into one book, it's the Nasser 5-pounder, the service book by Father Seraphim Nasser. You could actually do the basic services, not perfectly, but you could do it at least on some level just with that book.
Wow.
So that would be the first one that I would get, and then work your way from there.
Now, for doing the services at home, So you need a priest and you need the people, right, to do a liturgy, right? That's how
Right.
I've had it explained. You can't, like, a priest can't do the liturgy by themselves with
Right.
nobody, and people can't do it without. But what can the lady do in their own home without a priest?
You can do everything but the sacraments, and you can do one of the sacraments. You can baptize a baby without a priest. So any
Wow,
Orthodox layman can do that.
I did not
Uh,
know that.
yeah, but so if you're in an emergency, everybody should know that. If you're in an emergency, your wife has a baby, and the doctor's saying, "Oh no, this baby might not make it." You should have some holy water handy and baptize that child immediately. And you just take the holy water and sprinkle it 3 times on the baby. And each time you say, "The servant of God so and so is baptized in the name of the Father," sprinkle, and of the Son, sprinkle, and of the Holy Spirit, sprinkle. Amen. And
Right,
actually, you say Amen after each name of the Holy Trinity.
right,
Uh,
right,
but if you do that, that child's baptized. Now, if the child lives, the priest will do a service to complete the baptism and then chrismate the baby.
right.
But that's something everybody should know. But you can do everything else. So there's a whole cycle of services,
Yeah,
and the liturgy is only part of that. It's really not. It's technically kind of outside of that cycle because the liturgy is its own thing.
yeah,
But everything else in the liturgical cycle is something that you can do without a priest. There's some modifications that you make to it, but you can do them.
hmm,
And for example, our parish, we started off doing reader services most of the time because I was a deacon when we got the blessing to start the mission.
right.
And uh, we did a lot of feast day services. That was, we just did the vigil and Typica. Uh, we even did some Holy Week services that way until we were able to get a priest that would come. I think every Pascha we were able to get a priest, which is not something every mission parish is able to do.
Right.
But I have the entire Holy Week services all laid out to where you can do them without a priest. So what I would suggest, one of the things I would suggest you do is if you want to prepare for the possibility that you might not have access to that stuff, is print that stuff out, put it into a good ring binder, and that way you can do those services if you need to.
Yeah, we hear rumblings of, future cyber attack from like Davos. We'll talk about, oh, the coming cyber attack. And so it's a very real possibility that we could lose access to the internet, during a crisis or some sort of catastrophe. And I think that's great advice to not just totally be dependent on the electronic and the digital. It's a good tool that we can use now, but there should definitely be backups and redundancies there. That last question sort of led into a question that was asked by our friend Eric, who says, "What do we do if our bishops preach heresy?" He sent that to me via Instagram. Anybody, if you guys have questions, you can send them to me via the super chat links in the description, just so everybody knows.
Well, I mean, it's because jurisdictional divisions are not great, but I think that they might very well be providential, because if we had a united Orthodox jurisdiction in this country, there are a lot of people who would be stuck like Chuck,
Right,
because during the whole COVID lockdowns, they wouldn't have had any alternatives.
right.
Uh, but in the United States, at least, if you have a bishop that's preaching heresy, you can go find a bishop that's not preaching heresy.
Yeah. So your advice then is to go where the truth is, right? And to not, okay, because I think a lot of people are struggling with that. I have friends who are, seeing what's going on with GoArch or with the EP and things like that, and they don't know what to do. They love their parishes, they love, so that I think that's where the spirit of the question came from. Is people are
Right.
in the parish and it's a good parish and good community, but they're not okay with what their hierarchy is doing.
Well,
What
one thing
about
I would
that?
say about that is if you have a priest that's a pious priest and you're in the Greek Archdiocese and there's no other parishes that are around you, the canon that talks about separating from a bishop preaching heresy does not say that it's mandatory to separate from that bishop prior to synodal verdict. It just says that you can separate from them.
Right.
And so, at least as things stand right now, where there's not been a formal condemnation of these bishops, uh, it would not be a sin for you to keep going to a priest, particularly if the priest is a pious, right believing priest. And I happen to know some of these priests, and I think that when the day comes and push comes to shove, they're going to be on the same side of the schism that we're on. I think they're going to be with us at the end of the day rather than with the heretics if it actually comes to that.
Do you think it will come to that?
If I was going to bet money, I would say that it will. I hope that it doesn't, but I don't see people like Patriarch Bartholomew or Archbishop de Forest backing off. Now, I could see some scenarios where they might back off, but it would require basically that they were getting pressure from every local church.
Right.
And in that circumstance, I could see how they might back off. But as things stand right now, I think that they're perfectly comfortable with continuing down the road that they're going. And they seem to me to be intent on leaving the church at some point in the not too distant future,
right,
and uniting with Rome.
Right.
And I think 2025 is the target date for that.
Really? Yeah, that's what I was about to ask is, in terms of ecumenism or things like that, is that really the main attack that you see against the church at this moment is the reunification with Rome and this push towards more open, inclusive Christianity?
Well, the blog that you mentioned earlier, there were 4 parts to it that talked about the different ways that you've got people inside the church that are trying to redefine orthodoxy. And the point of my series was basically that these people are not going to change orthodoxy. They're going to establish their own religion, and you're going to see them outside the church at some point.
Right.
And so I was trying to tell people, here's where it's coming. And it's coming in various forms. One of them is them pushing abortion, obviously pushing the alphabet soup stuff, modernism, ecumenism, liturgical renovationism. I think before long you're going to see these people ordaining women as priests and inevitably ordaining women as bishops.
Well, we did see female altar servers recently. I know that priest did get what put on leave or what, they were
got suspended. So that shows that the Church of Greece and the ecumenical patriarch are not exactly on the same page, which is a good thing.
Right. Yeah, that's shocking when you see it's like you're supposedly Orthodox, like I don't understand the progressive mindset for people. It's like, why don't you just go to the Roman Catholic Church if that's what you want? But I guess I think that comes from an intentional subversion, because if they wanted something more progressive, they could go to Roman Catholicism. They could get that, but they're here.
Right.
In a place where we're supposed to be protecting the tradition. So, yeah.
They could go to the Episcopal Church, which would probably be a better fit than even the Roman Catholics.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I have an article I wanted to show you. This kind of tied in with what we talked about earlier about the problems with divorce and marriage. I saw this on another YouTube channel and I couldn't believe it. So I'm going to show you this article if that's all right with you. And we sort of have a tradition at this channel where I show the guests something cringy from culture and get their take on it. This one, I think you'll definitely have something to say about.
Okay.
This is a New York Post article. And the headline is, "I divorced my dying husband. He wallowed in self-pity and killed my vibe." And so this husband had cancer, and this wife divorced her husband because he killed her vibe. Till near death do us part. A woman has opened up about why she divorced her dying husband, saying his 5-year cancer battle took a toll on their marriage as he wallowed in self-pity. Yana Fry, 40, wed her late husband when she was 22 years old and dreamed of starting a family with him. But the bride's dreams were soon dashed when her husband, then 37, was diagnosed with testicular cancer. Let's see. "We couldn't really think about our future," Fry told Caters. "How can you plan for your future as a newly married couple when you're struggling with something like cancer? People react in one of 2 ways to critical illnesses. I've seen it over and over," she continued. "The first type was how my husband unfortunately was, the people who drown in self-pity. The second type of people are those who instead are concerned with everyone else around them." So let me just stop it right there. So obviously, very entitled, very much like, well, nobody's thinking about me and what I want. I mean, yeah, he's got testicular cancer, but like nobody asked if I was okay, right? there's a little bit of truth in there, right? Like the man should care about his wife, and I'm sure he did. I mean, who knows? But the
Well,
divorce
we're
thing,
only hearing her side of it, and she's trying
right?
to spin it to justify divorcing her dying husband. So she might be
Right.
exaggerating a little bit.
Isn't that insane?
Yeah. Uh, the thing is, one way you can tell whether something is ethical or not is to think about how you would judge it when you see other people doing it. When we see people who are being lazy and they're not working and they're just taking from other people, if we're doing that, we don't see it in ourselves. We're perfectly willing to be that person. But when we see it in somebody else, we say, well, that's pretty disgusting. That person ought to be contributing to their family, not just sitting there soaking up all the resources and sponging off their relatives. Well, when you see a wife doing this, I think everybody has an instinctive reaction that says, that's not what a wife ought to do to her husband. A wife ought to be by her husband until he dies,
Right.
and try to comfort him. I mean, that's why the old Protestant marriage ceremony had that "till death do us part" line in there, and in sickness and in health, because that stuff can happen.
Yeah.
But we often would excuse it if we were that woman and we didn't want to deal with all that stuff. So we have to think about how we see it. We would judge it when we see it in other people, and then realize that if we would excuse it in ourselves, that's wrong.
Sure.
And this is pretty horrible. When you marry someone, you do have this desire to have somebody who's going to be with you and have your back no matter what.
And have a good family. She said she wanted to have kids and, have all these dreams of what is going to happen. But then you get a situation that's not what you bargained for, what you expected. And then I guess you see the real character come out in a person.
Right. And if you want to have that kind of a spouse, you need to try to be that kind of a spouse. Right. She obviously wanted a very solid marriage, but you're never going to have a solid marriage if you're not the kind of wife that's going to make for that solid marriage. And maybe if she just stood by her husband and encouraged him rather than making him feel like he was a worthless pile of crap, maybe he wouldn't have been wallowing in self-pity, and maybe he would have been able to get the treatment that he needed to recover. So you need to be the kind of a spouse that you're looking for if you want to have a traditional solid marriage.
Right. And I do think, with testicular cancer, I think you're given just a little bit of room for self-pity. Just give the guy a little bit of self-pity. I mean, that's a rough one. That's a rough one to deal with as a guy.
Right.
So, yeah, man, she goes on in the article to talk about how nobody asked her if she was in a counseling group or, nobody cared about her counseling and stuff. And I think that just shows so much of what people are lacking outside of the church. We have such a push in culture for therapy. You get YouTube advertisements all the time. Are you in therapy? Get a therapist, get a counselor. Right. And in my own life, I've seen the way that therapy and counseling ends up making people worse and puts people on, psychotropic medication, or ends up breaking up marriages or breaking up relationships. And we get that sort of therapy and that counseling in the church, in our community. When you're a part of the community, when you have a relationship with your spiritual father, with your father confessor, this acts as like a wholesome and holistic therapy that is way better and way more efficacious than any sort of worldly secular therapy I've ever seen.
Well, I think that in some cases, I don't think that's a normal thing, but in some cases there might be a place for a therapist. But I think that the kind of therapist that you want to find is someone who's an Orthodox Christian. And if you can't find an Orthodox Christian who's a therapist, you'd want to at least find someone who is a Christian of some sort, right, that was going to approach it from a faith standpoint, and certainly wasn't going to take the "how do we dope them up" approach.
Right.
But it depends on the circumstances. I think that some of those people can help, and it depends on the circumstance. But yeah, for most people, going to confession and having a spiritual father is the best kind of therapy that you could possibly get, and you don't have to pay for it.
Right.
You have to tithe, but you don't have to. You don't have to pay extra for the time that you spend with your priest. Right. And if you take counseling classes in college, one of the things that they'll tell you is the most important thing a counselor can do is just listen to people. So you're paying somebody a ridiculous amount of money, and mainly what they're doing is they're just listening to you and listening with empathy. in some cases, they really don't even have the empathy, but they're taught to act like they have empathy. Whereas a priest actually will have empathy in most cases if he's a decent priest, if he's worthy of the name.
Yeah.
And
it's sort of that stereotype of, and how does that make you feel? You see
right,
that in movies a lot. Yeah.
right,
Yeah, it's wild. I think I'm a little biased because like previous relationships and stuff, I've seen the sort of feminist counselor, therapist, or whatever, and just how toxic that can be for a woman to have this person that you're paying. You're literally paying them to tell you you're right. Like of course they're gonna want to
right,
make you happy and feel good
right.
because you're their paycheck. So
Yeah,
um,
if you have a therapist that's not approaching it from a faith standpoint, then you're wasting your money.
right.
And certainly when it comes to psychiatric medications, I think that there's probably some cases where you could justify taking some of that stuff on a short-term basis.
Yeah.
But I've seen that stuff really mess people up, and the problem is no drug has the same effect long term,
Right.
and so that can't be the only solution to your problems. If it is, it's not going to last.
And all throughout history, we've seen, at least in modern history, we've seen drugs get overprescribed during a period because they're pushing it and they want to make money or whatever, and then comes out later that it's really bad, and we've seen this happen over and over again, and so it's just very dangerous. I think there's
Right,
definitely, like you said, a time and place and certain things, but you have to really be discerning. And I think people are way too trusting of big pharma. They're way too trusting of the sort of medical establishment that they'll just take whatever they give them, and if that doesn't work, take the other thing. And
yeah. Fortunately, I think COVID has disabused a lot of people of just trusting the so-called experts. But
yes,
I can tell you just from my own experience, seeing how somebody that I loved was destroyed by psychiatric care
right,
that was not cheap, that was very expensive,
right,
and basically wound up resulting in their death. I have almost zero faith in those kinds of people, having seen it up close. And uh, in this case, this person was given he was being treated by the best in the field,
right,
and it didn't work, and he wound up in that situation because he went to a psychiatric hospital where they shot him up with the wrong medication. He had basically had a minor problem, went into the psychiatric hospital, got shot up with the wrong medications, which really screwed up his head. And then
wow,
after that, there was no fix for it.
man, that is terrifying.
Yep.
Wow. Yeah, this I don't know. It's just a totally different mindset. I think when you're lacking the faith in the relationship with God, this different mindset of like looking for a pill or a medicine that's going to fix you, whereas we sort of have a more holistic way of looking at it. Like you're a body, you're a soul, you're a mind. It's all these three things, and they all
Right.
have to be working right. They all have to be in their proper place and working right, or otherwise you're going to have problems all over the place.
Right. Right.
And I think people with this totally materialistic secular worldview, it's all about chemicals and the dopamine and serotonin, and one of these things is off balance, so we have to take this pill to fix it. And it just opens the doors for these sort of problems to happen because chances are that the solution might be, you feel sad or you feel depressed because you're sinning and you're not in relationship with Christ, and so maybe
That's also true.
right,
What I would say is for most people, if they ate the right kind of food, if they were eating healthy food, if they were getting exercise, if they were getting their hands in the dirt and out in nature,
right,
and they were also living a Christian life and going to church and receiving the sacraments, I think most of uh, their mental health problems would be resolved. The
yeah,
problem is that we live an artificial life, we eat artificial food, we live our lives in virtual reality, and then we wonder why we're all screwed up. We weren't
right.
designed to live this way, so you have to start living the way you were designed,
Right.
because that's what you were built for, and that's where you're actually going to thrive.
Yeah, it's really hard to be depressed if you're in a community that loves you. You have a place, you have responsibilities, you're giving alms, you're helping out people that are maybe sick or visiting people in prison, or you're feeding the poor. It's really hard to be depressed and like, oh, woe is me, when you're experiencing people who really have it bad. And
Right.
then you can reflect on the blessings you have. And so I think a large portion of the depression and anxiety and the sort of social disorders people experience come from that
Right.
not living a good life, like you said.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's wild. You talked about how we live an artificial life, and that sort of leads into what else I wanted to ask you about, which is AI, the sort of push for AI. What do you see? What kind of a role do you see that playing in the future, in your perspective? The sort of artificial intelligence. We've got like Chat GPT, we've got AI girlfriends being promoted now on online. Get an AI girlfriend; she'll text you and send you pictures.
I could see people getting sucked into that in ways that would be definitely very unhealthy. I also think that, if you think we're getting exposed to psyops now, just wait until they fully develop the ability to make it look like something happened that didn't happen.
Right.
And they're already pretty much there. So it's going to make things very difficult. So we're going to have to be even more discerning than we were in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's wild, man. I've heard people say that they think that there's like a demonic aspect to AI. I know Father Turbo has talked about on his podcast. Do you think there's any merit to that? Do you think there's anything demonic
I think that there's
associated?
something demonic about a lot of what's involved in technology, because we have people that are trying to, their motivations are bad to start off with. I wouldn't say that any AI technology is automatically evil or demonic, and I don't, I've certainly not dug into it enough, in terms of how it's actually put together to speak from some kind of vantage point of, being an expert on the subject.
Right.
I just know that we have to be real careful, and particularly when you've got the potential. For example, they've already got people who, scammers that are taking people's voices, because maybe you're posting videos of your kids on YouTube. And
Right.
so someone can take videos of your kids and record their voices, put it into an AI program, and then call you up in the middle of the night and act like they're your kid and they're in a dangerous situation. And if you don't send them $10,000 right away, someone's going to slit their throat. Well, and that could be totally bogus, and that's already happened. That's not just me pulling a possibility out of the air. That kind of stuff happens
Right.
now, and
Right.
it's only going to get worse. So I think that is bad, and I really think that the government ought to regulate it and not allow stuff like that to be put out there.
Yeah.
I could see how it might be useful in some limited circumstances, but the idea of just letting everybody have access to programs that are capable of that kind of stuff is not good.
Yeah, there's definitely a double-edged sword to that. I think on one hand it is good, because if the government is the only ones to have access to that kind of stuff, right, then they can sort of create this whole theater, much like they do now, and we'd have
Right.
no idea. But when we have access to it, that sort of allows us to reverse engineer and have a better understanding of it, so that we can maybe see it when it's happening in front of us.
Well,
But then, like you say, it
there's a
opens up.
point there.
Yeah,
I just, to me, it just seems like it's a very dangerous thing, and there ought to be. I mean, maybe what they ought to do is they ought to require the people who are doing AI programs, they put fingerprints into the programming that wind up being discernible when you're actually examining the product.
right.
So there's a way of determining, yeah, this was not real.
Yeah, I think at the point we're at now, I think that at least now there's ways to tell, but I could see it in a couple of years, just a couple of years, it being much, much harder
Right.
to discern whether or not a video we're seeing is actually real, or whether it's just something that's been generated with these programs.
Right.
I think any technology, there's that danger, but these are definitely wild times, unprecedented times, it seems, with the
Right.
technology aspect of it. Compared to how you thought of things maybe in the 70s, like looking forward into the future, how different is nowadays to what you thought it would be?
Well, I would have thought that the world would have been destroyed by nuclear war when I was growing up in the 70s, because that's all we heard.
Right.
And particularly, you not only saw it in the secular media, but if you grew up as an evangelical Protestant at that time, you probably heard lots of sermons that added to that. Because I think when I was a kid, I probably heard an end time sermon maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks. and they were designed to scare the pants off of you.
Right.
And they were fairly effective at that end. And so I honestly remember being a kid and thinking I probably will never live to be an adult.
Yeah.
And fortunately, I didn't let that keep me from going to college and getting an education, because I'd be pretty mad now.
Some people nowadays, that does happen,
Right.
because I think every generation people think the world's going to end by the time they're
Well,
30.
there were people back then they would use that as an excuse. Well, I'm not going to go to college because the world's probably not going to last long enough for me to graduate. On the other hand, I remember a Baptist minister, he was saying we ought to borrow as much money as we can to spread the gospel, and then leave the bill to the Antichrist. So that would have been another way to look at it, is, hey, get your education now and you won't have to worry about paying it back if the world ends.
Yep. I've heard the same kind of rhetoric when I was growing up too. So I think that's really interesting to see how the sort of human condition never changes throughout history. Everybody's always complaining about these kids these days, and they don't listen to their parents like they should, like they used to, and every generation thinks that the end is like right around the corner. But I mean, man, it really seems like it is. It still really seems
the
like
kind of stuff we're seeing right now is not just a rehash of things that have always been going on.
Right.
There are evils that we're seeing that were unimaginable for most of human history.
Right. Even just the impact that this pandemic has had on the church, I think, is really telling too. Just the amount that it was able to affect the true church is that's a little telling, I think.
Right. But like I said, though, I think it might be God's mercy that we were allowed to go through something and then get on the other side of it and learn something from it. Because I do know that there's a lot of people who, if they had to do it over again, would have handled that stuff a lot differently. Right. And they might get a chance to do it over again. So then we'll see how many of them really learn the lesson.
They very likely will. I mean, I'd say if I was a betting man, I'd say it's about 100% chance. Yeah. I mean, they didn't do that just for no reason. I think they're testing out maybe compliance, testing out to see how people would react and to see how far along the populations have gotten domesticated. But man, I'm going through my notes. Well, let's look at the super chats we got here. Thank you everybody for supporting the show. I didn't see any questions, but let me just run through and say thank you to everybody who has supported the show. Also, I forgot to mention we do have a Patreon, so shout out to our 3 patrons over there on Patreon. I know Amy is over there, Jason's over there, and Deanna is over there. Thank you guys so much. If you guys want to support via Patreon, you can do so via the links in the channel's About section. Thank you so much to Amy, who sent in $10. She said, "You're awesome." No, you're awesome, Amy. Thank you. Jason sent in $6. Didn't say anything. Thank you so much, Jason. Thomas sent in 20. Maddie sent in another $3.50 and says, "For huge thanks to Father John for sharing his wisdom today." Thank you so much, Maddie, and thank you so much to Father John as well. Slowboy Whiteboard says, "Thank you, Father John," and I think that's about everything. Let me just double check my notes and make sure we covered everything I wanted to cover. I guess looking forward into the future and looking at the things like we just talked about, technology, ecumenism, the problem with gender roles and all these things that are falling apart. What can you say to the young Orthodox Christians today? What should they really focus on? What should they do to sort of steel themselves and their families to keep themselves in faith, right?
Well, the key is plugging into an Orthodox parish and trying to live as traditional of a life as you can, and finding a way that you're going to be able to pay your bills to where you're not going to have to bow the knee to bail, and raising your kids to where you're protecting them from this kind of stuff. Homeschooling, or maybe if you're able to get an Orthodox school going, would be an alternative. But basically, keeping your kids out of public schools is one of the most important things that you can do. Because when I see kids that go to public schools, it's very rare that I see kids that are well balanced, traditionally minded Orthodox Christians. Now, my hope is that they are going to be able to bounce back from the indoctrination that they got.
Right.
And I know that their parents are, in many cases, trying to fight against that influence. But when you have a kid in school for 8 hours a day, and then maybe there's only a couple of hours in the evening every night during the school year that you're able to spend any time with your kid, and most of that time they're doing homework or on their phones, or you're doing stuff, and so you're really not having that much time to actually interact with them. That 8 hours of the day at the public school is going to have a lot more influence than your maybe 15-minute conversation with your kid on a good day.
Oh yeah.
So you really need to get your kids out of that environment and raise them in an environment where they're going to be taught how to actually read, write, do math, and that sort of stuff, but also how to be an Orthodox Christian and right. To love God. And they're not going to get that in the public schools. I mean, in the Soviet Union, you got all the indoctrination from the communists, but at least at the end of the day, you did get a decent education. You did know how to do math, and you did know how to read. You did know how to write. You could appreciate good literature. You might be an artist or a musician. There are lots of great things about the Soviet education system. We don't have any of that in our public schools. We just suck, and you get the indoctrination. So why would you put your kids in that kind of an environment? Because they're not going to get a decent education, and they're going to be brainwashed. There's no redeeming value to it.
I think people are just so drained, and they're so lethargic, and they're so beat down and poisoned by the bad food and by the sort of unnatural state that they're in, that they just don't see how it's possible. I mean, you get this sort of this vibe, I guess, of people that are just, I could never homeschool. I'm so tired. They give their 3-year-old a tablet, and they put them in their bedroom, and it's like, you just watch YouTube or watch Peppa the Pig or whatever, and I'm gonna go lay in my bed and go to sleep. And like, that's become sort of the average parenting, I guess, and public school is just an extension of that.
You have to live a lifestyle that's conducive to the kind of life that you want to live. And my wife and I, we homeschooled our kids. Most of the time we were homeschooling them, I was basically paying the bills with my salary from the state of Texas. It was only later, towards the tail end, that I started to get a stipend from my parish that amounted to very much. And but we chose to make some sacrifices, and so we're not living in a mansion. We're living in a decent house, a small house by the standards of a lot of houses in Texas, but a decent house. And we skimped on a lot of stuff. Fortunately, I have a wife that's from a third world country, and so she wasn't like a lot of American women, always demanding the nicest and the best stuff. She was willing to live frugally. As a matter of fact, I thought I was a tightwad until I met my wife, and she makes me look like a spendthrift all the time. I was a real big penny pincher. Partly, I grew up. My parents got divorced when I was 6. And my mother made a very valiant effort to raise 5 boys on her own, and did a pretty good job of it. But one thing that meant is that in my family, when we got to be 15 years old, we had to change the date of our birth on a job application and start working.
Yep.
And so when I was going to school starting at the age of 15, I was working 30 hours a week typically, and sometimes I was working 40-hour weeks. I remember one time I was working as a sacker in Kroger's, and they had me working a midnight shift like 4 nights in a row during the school year.
Right.
And I was having to get up early to catch the bus to go to school.
Yep.
And this is not a joke. This really happened. I woke up because I was dreaming all night that I was sacking groceries. And then I woke up and I was loading my pillow into my nightstand. That's the God's honest truth. This happened. And I was falling asleep in class. But the thing is, I appreciate the fact that I had those kinds of hardships, because it did teach me the value of a dollar. And when I went to a private college, and because I was wanting to be a Nazarene minister, and most of the people that I went to school with came from fairly well-off families that were footing the bill for their kids to go to school. So they didn't have any money worries, whereas my name was on all the loans I was taking. My parents weren't signing for anything. And so I was going to have to pay back every penny that I was borrowing. And so I actually wanted to get the most out of my college education that I possibly could. And I spent my time studying, whereas I had all these friends that had everything handed to them on a silver platter, and they were partying.
Yep.
And what one thing that was happening in that school was the freshman class was always bigger than the other three classes put together, because after the first semester, when parents got to see their report cards coming back,
Right.
they would pull the plug on it.
Yep.
And then after the end of the freshman year, even more of them pulled the plug. And so when they came back as a sophomore class, it was a greatly diminished class.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So it's, but anyway, it's good to have the value of a dollar, and to realize that you can get by with less.
For sure.
And when you're footing the bill yourself, and trying to get by in life, that you start getting that sense. But both my wife and I, we were conditioned to be able to live a life at a lower level. So we didn't buy brand new furniture when we got married. We got used furniture for free. We used folding tables for our dinette set. We had a folding table for our kitchen table. I used to carry a peanut butter jar as my coffee mug to class when I was in college. And I would just use that jar with the lid on it to hold my coffee when I would go to class.
Right.
I can afford a little bit better than that now. I've got a real mug now.
Nice.
But back then I couldn't afford it, so I just made do. You'd be surprised at what you can make do at if you're willing to. So you just have to make some sacrifices.
Well, I totally understand that. I don't know how much you know about my history, but I spent almost a decade being a hobo, hopping trains and hitchhiking and traveling the country. So I 100% agree with, you can make do with a lot less than what you think you can, because that was like my whole life was minimized. Book bag, I'm good. Like
Right,
I have a campfire, I'll make my my camp set up, and I'm happy. But I do think that builds character, like what you're saying about having less and having to work for what you have. That's sort of the upbringing I had. I had a paper route when I was 14. I got my first job when I was 15, and I worked ever since then. And then I had friends who come for money, and like you said, they don't value the stuff. They had it all handed to them, and they end up partying, having serious addiction or drinking problems, or so there's definitely something there to be said about having to work for what you have. And then to comment on what I was saying before about how people are so lethargic, I think that one thing I can say about that is that when we are living a sacramental life, these sacraments are breathing life back into people. And I see families at my parish who have 7 kids, 8 kids, and yes, it's hard work, but they're just full of the love of God, and they're so happy to serve and to help others, even with all of this stuff that they're suffering under. And then you look at a secular person who's got 1 kid, and they're like, "I'm gonna die, I can't handle this." And so I think there's definitely something to be said about the real, like, literal reality of the energies of Christ, and how they breathe life into people, and they give you a lot of strength in parenting. And so I think a good thing to tell people is, like, if you're worried about how you're going to do it, like, have faith, put your faith in God, and trust that he's going to give you what you need and take care of you. And when I see people do that in my life, it usually works out good for them. So but yeah, I think it calls us to, one second, I'm waiting for this plane. Okay, Christ calls us to a life of poverty, and I've heard that said, and that basically what a life of poverty is, it means you share, right? Because when you're poor people, they share what they have. They live as a group with their family or with their community, because they know that they need to share in order to survive, in order to keep going. And so it doesn't necessarily mean have no money, but it just means to have that sort of love and that compassion for your fellow man and for the people in your community, and to help each other along. And I think that even if you have money, that's a good mind frame to be in.
Right.
Yeah. So thank you so much for coming on, Father. I think that's about wraps it up. Is there anything else you'd like to comment on? Anything you'd like to tell the audience, or is there any sort of fundraising you're doing? Or I have all your links in the description, but anything you want to tell the audience, go for it.
Well, we will be doing some fundraising for a new church building in the not too distant future, I hope. But that's still in the works. But also the Ludwell Orthodox Fellowship, which is at southernorthodox.org, is going to be having a conference, the first one of its kind.
Nice.
It's going to be in Tobaccoville, North Carolina, on September the 15th. And if you go to that website, you can get the details there. But we're going to be talking about spreading the Orthodox faith in the South and how those two things can go together.
Nice. That's awesome. And yeah, the website, stjonah.org is your parish site.
Right.
And then your blog is fatherjohn.blogspot.com. Right. Okay, so everybody, please go and follow those websites, and also be sure to sign up for the Patristic Faith newsletter. If you just Google Father John Whiteford, Patristic Faith, you'll find his profile and all the articles he wrote over there. Definitely check out his blog. Definitely check out Patristic Faith and sign up for that, because, man, you'll find so much good stuff over there. And I hope to speak with you again soon. Thank you so much for coming on, and it was a great honor to have you.
Good talking to you.
Good talking to you as well, Father. Thank you so much. And everybody, if you want to support the show after, all the links work. Like I said, subscribe to EPL Clips, Exposing Powerful Lies over on Rumble and Patreon. And that's it. So everybody have a good night. God bless. And until next time, later. Peace. See ya.